Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most trusted voice in true crime. I hope wherever you are in the world that you're doing okay, that you're handling things. Things do seem to be getting pretty scary in certain places, especially across America at this time. When we look at something like misunderstood aspects of the Chris Watts case, we're not just looking at that, we're actually asking ourselves, how good a handle do we have on reality? And obviously, if we've got a handle on someone else's reality, we've got a reasonable chance of having a handle on our own reality. And so the Chris Watts case, many people have moved on from it, but for those who are still interested in it, it presents a very important challenge to say, well, here's a lot of information. Can you tell what is true? Can you see the nuance? Can you see the subtlety? Can you see reality? Can you see what is actually going on in these people's lives? And that is important. It's important to be able to tell the difference between the surface of things, of people, of situations, of dynamics, and what is below the surface. Now, anyone can look below the surface and see whatever they want. The challenge is looking below the surface and seeing something that is purposefully hidden and being able to connect it to reality and to as large an extent as we can. And that's kind of what True Crime Rocket Science is all about. I actually put up just as a kind of experiment or a challenge to myself, I just try to put all the books that I've written, all the series chronologically together, and just put them side by side to see all of the books in a glance. And obviously when I look at those books, it's almost 100 by now. I also challenge myself, how good are you? How good are you at telling the reality, not only about other people, especially the Watts family and others that I've written books about, but also yourself, also about your world. Can you see the reality in this world in terms of the coronavirus? Because it's important that we do. If you're going to respond to your environment, it helps to know your environment, but it also helps to know yourself. What are you capable of? What are you not capable of? What are your weaknesses in terms of seeing things and not seeing things? What are your personality issues where you might have a certain way of denying certain things or overemphasizing other things? And, are you too simplistic in your judgments? Are you too slow in your judgments? So it's all about being able to see what is around us in an accurate way. And what we're really talking about here is human psychology. Are we able to tell who a person is? Are we able to tell who other people are? And are they able to tell who we are? And that to me has been a shocking and disappointing aspect of the Watts case, is that it doesn't seem like we are. It seems like with all the information we have, our phones, our computers, we've become less good at navigating the world. We've really lost our ability to move through our environment and get along with other people, just in a general way. Just because we're always on our devices and we think that by searching for something we're going to get the answer, but often we're just getting the answer that we're looking for. What is the answer? So in this episode, we're going to look at a couple of more misunderstandings. We're going to look at Shannann's health briefly. We're going to look at how long did Nicole Kissinger know Chris Watts? How long was their relationship? Also very briefly. We're going to look at something to do with the children that I think's been heavily overlooked. and then finally Chris Watts' personality. As I say, we're going to go through those 4 things quickly, and then we're going to go deal with the thing that I really want to deal with, which is it's actually something I've been promising my patrons. It's really a response to a video made by another creator where he was sort of seemed to be saying that the crime scene at Saratoga Trail was just like 2 hours long, and he was sort of kind of undermining the effectiveness and efficacy, if that's the word, the protocols. Was this investigation conducted properly? And we're going to, in terms of time, that just kind of seemed to be the main way of us measuring it, and we're going to look at that in a kind of a serious way. So I also just want to thank the 300 or so people who've subscribed to this channel in the last couple of days. It's good to have you here. If you're new to this channel, please leave a comment, share with your networks if you find this episode interesting, and ring the bell if you want further notifications. And let's get started. So I want to start by, and again I'm touching on these very briefly, a lot more briefly than they deserve to be, but I've certainly dealt with this in my books and on the Crime Rocket blog, repeatedly. But in terms of Shannann's health, somebody recently made the comment that they don't believe that she had lupus, and that the autopsy proves that. And I kind of get the feeling with the Chris Watts case, what kind of makes it different, I think it's because Shan'ann used social media so much that her story got shared a lot on social media. But I kind of get the feeling people who were never really interested in true crime, or didn't really know much about true crime, or were sort of just unfamiliar with it, came into this case because of Shannann's the unusual amount of her social media. And so I kind of get the feeling some people just don't understand some basic aspects of true crime that well. And an example is something like autopsy evidence. Autopsy evidence is what the coroner finds when he examines a body, right? It's a little bit like coming to a crime scene. You come to a crime scene, and then it pretends to be what you see is what you get, but crime scenes never are. There's certain things that the perpetrator has removed. There's certain things that circumstances like weather or time or something have interfered with or covered over, and then the other things that you simply don't see because of clutter or whatever it is. A crime scene has evidence, but the evidence isn't what you see is what you get. There's more to that evidence than what meets the eye. And I think a good way of explaining it is to say, often when you see blood traces at a cleaned up crime scene, the blood will appear very, very light pink in color. Why? Because what's happened is that blood has been diluted, it's been washed, water has passed over that blood. And you get an especially good example of this in the Amanda Knox case at the Meredith Kercher crime scene. You've got small traces of blood and streams of blood going down the door and on faucets and in different places in the basin. But then under Meredith's body, you've got these almost black-red areas of congealed blood. And then you've also got areas adjacent to that where you have, again, the pinkish blood. And pink blood like that speaks of water and it being diluted and movement and washing and wiping and all that kind of thing. So in terms of Shannann's health, I don't think the absence of a reference to lupus or fibromyalgia is necessarily telling us anything. It may be, but on the other hand, lupus, if you know a little bit about lupus, it's a little bit like cancer. it can go into remission. So somebody who has cancer, and then they go into remission, and then they are, for all intents or purposes, healthy at the time that they die, and then you say, well, oh, so they never had cancer. That's a little bit, it's not accurate, right? Personally, I was surprised that it didn't come up in the autopsy, but Shan'ann did seem healthy. I wouldn't say so much during her pregnancy, but in the last couple of months of her life, prior to the pregnancy, she looked quite good compared to what she looked like several years earlier, and you can look at those photos as reference photos. So that's one part to address. The other part to address is, I don't think it's as important whether Shan'ann was healthy or not, to that she believed she wasn't healthy, and because of that she went to the doctor quite often, and the result of that was additional medical bills. That to me is the issue. I don't see it as that important whether she had something or not, but how did it manifest? And it manifested as medical expenses. The other reason why I think the lupus is a reality is on Shannann's Twitter page. She follows a whole host of lupus related accounts. She was celebrating lupus month or lupus anniversaries for years. Everybody around her was aware of it. Her husband, her parents, her brother, her friends. And lupus is one of those sicknesses where it is confusing to people because the symptoms are kind of invisible, and there's things like moodiness and things like that, and also because there's a sort of a spectrum of it, and so some people can have it really badly and some can have it in a mild way. So I think it's widely assumed that Shan'ann either was a hypochondriac or something, and that she didn't have lupus at all. I don't think that's true. I think the fact that her children were quite sickly is kind of a evidence of that, and Shannann's anxiety in terms of Nutgate is evidence that she genuinely believed that she had something. I think anyone in a situation where there's a disease floating around, including coronavirus, it is absolutely normal to be hypervigilant, to be very sort of, almost paranoid. It's actually normal to be paranoid about, do you have it? Are you sick? Whatever. So I think it's a bit unfair of people to call Shan'ann, talk about the whole thing of hypochondria, or also Munchausen by proxy. I think it's a bit judgmental to say that, because I think lupus was a factor. I also think those people have a point in that Shan'ann was overly anxious about health issues, but I think that was normal under her circumstances, just as it's normal to be that way with coronavirus right now. So was health an issue? Yes, it was an issue. Did Shan'ann exaggerate it? Perhaps she did to some extent. Nutgate seems to show that. But was Shan'ann somewhat justified in exaggerating it? I think so. Does the autopsy, the fact that certain things aren't in the autopsy, prove that she didn't have it? No, it doesn't. Equally, if there's certain substances not in the autopsy, especially of the children, does it mean they weren't there? No, it doesn't, because chemicals can destroy other chemicals. So the autopsy is just giving you what it's giving you. You need to do a certain amount of reading into it. And what I've told my patrons is, a good example, autopsy evidence is disputed all the time. You don't just have an autopsy and that's the final analysis. John Benet Ramsey's autopsy report leaves a lot to be interpreted. Did she die of strangulation or of head injury? Rebecca Zahau is another good example. Did she die by manual strangulation, or was she hung with a ligature? And there you have two different assessments. The John Benet Ramsey is an incredible case for disputed and disputing coroner reports. So the next thing I want to go into is, how long did Nicole Kissinger know Chris Watts? And I see it all the time. People keep sort of going back to that Google search from months and months earlier. And they sort of seem to be making the case that Nicole Kissinger was far more involved than we are, than people realize, or something like that. And also, I guess that she's also an accessory or something like that. I don't believe either of those things. First of all, Chris Watts only was kind of in good shape. He was quite a overweight dude, and even when he lost weight, he still was quite a heavy guy in 2017. And he didn't just lose weight prior to meeting Nicole Kissinger. He actually lost a significant amount of weight in the 6 weeks that they were together. And a lot of what he did was quite recent. He only started running with Nick Thayer sort of in recent times, in the last couple of months. And so I don't think Nicole Kissinger was really attracted to him or noticed him really in early 2018. Bear in mind, she was in a male-dominated environment. There were a lot of other guys there as well. She's one of the few women, and I think she was aware of that. They were aware of that as well. But I do think Chris Watts lost weight, got into shape, and was sort of noticed around about the time that they say that happened. So late May, early June. So I believe when Chris Watts wanted to have the third child, I don't think the relationship was really happening then with Kessinger. I think he may have noticed her and been attracted to her, but I don't think it was mutual. And that, I think, is an important thing. Why did Chris Watts want a child if he was really in love with somebody else? Was that just a mistake? You might say that, but it just doesn't really add up. Because if that was the case, he would have not wanted the child early on, and that whole response to the pregnancy thing would, I think, have been even more different than it was. I do think he had mixed feelings at the time. I do think their relationship was in trouble at the time. Their marriage was in trouble, and the third child was related to that. So the other aspect to address, which is really common sense, is if you say, well, I'm not saying Nicole Kissinger didn't do that search. I do think that it could be a typo or a mistake. It's also possible that it's not a mistake, but I don't put too much value in it because there's just one search. It's not like there's a search and then there's another search. I don't know what you like. I don't know if you are in love with a particular celebrity or whatever, but most people who are interested in something search for it multiple times a day, every day for weeks. This was one search and then separated by weeks and months. And you might say, well, her activity was deleted. No, I don't think so. I don't think there were that many searches. Nicole Kissinger's internet activity is not yours. Nicole Kissinger wasn't on social media. Chris Watts wasn't really on social media either. So you applying your internet standards isn't an answer to what theirs were. And that's why I talk about, are you able to understand another reality besides your own? Because there is another one. It's somebody else's reality. And my reality and your reality are different. And within that is reality. You have your emotional reality and the way you see things. Those are both realities, but that's not reality. There's the reality beyond your reality, and that's what I'm kind of referring to. And people don't want to acknowledge that because it means they may have made a mistake. It means they may be wrong about something. It means that they aren't in control, and that's not a nice feeling. I've got news for you, though. We're not in control anyway. Even when we know something, or we give an animal a name, or a plant a name, or whatever, we classify something, that gives you a sense of control, but you don't really have control over anything at all. And interestingly, the issue of control is central to the Watts case. It's about a lack of control over finances, a lack of control over one's spouse. I'm talking about both ways. A effort to control a pregnancy for various reasons, and then ultimately the attempt to control one's future. In other words, by denying someone else their future, you give yourself a future. It's all about control. And what's the lesson out of it is no one was really in control. Shan'ann couldn't control her husband. Chris Watts couldn't control the pregnancy. Kessinger couldn't control the media narrative. I think the people who wanted to shut down the Watts case so that it didn't go to trial, did that work? So the Watts case is really about control and how difficult it is to control. There have been so many rumors, conspiracies and nonsense surrounding this case. It's gone out of control. One thing I will say about the Kessinger search is that I do think that she knew about him more and longer than just between June, July and the first 2 weeks of August. But by that I don't mean she knew him for months and months before that. I just mean I think she noticed him for a while and also was attracted to him, just as is normal in a workplace scenario. We've all been at a workplace scenario and you notice certain people, and that can go somewhere and it can maybe not go somewhere. It can I think Robin Curnow, who now works for CNN, used to work at a newsroom where I worked, and I noticed her. I thought she was quite attractive. I quite liked her. She was definitely going places, and I think I meant to talk to her. I was necessarily attracted to her, but I was intrigued by her, and the next thing she was gone. She's right now she's in Atlanta. But it happens all the time in workplaces. You notice someone and it's an invisible dynamic sometimes, and sometimes it manifests into something. It doesn't need to go on for years. It can go on for weeks. Maybe in Chris Watts' case, it went on for a little bit longer. It depends on when Nicole Kissinger started working at Anadarko, and I think she probably started in 2017, but that's another area that is not completely clear, and it should be. I know at one point I think I had the answer to that. I can't quite remember what it is now, when Nicole Kissinger started working. I think Chris Watts started working in 2015, so at least we know that. But Nicole Kissinger was a relatively new employee there, so it wasn't as though they'd both been working there for 5 years. And I do think when Nicole Kissinger started working at Anadarko, Chris Watts wasn't a standout guy. I don't think he was in a high position at that point, relatively high position. And I don't think he looked that great either. He was still losing weight and kind of, getting into the kind of shape that he wanted to get in. Kessinger, on the other hand, I think was in good shape regardless. Now, in terms of Chris Watts' personality, people have this is the area that I think is the most misunderstood about the Chris Watts case. I think if you speak to 7 out of 10 people, I think that's a fair guess of the proportion. I think if you speak to, say, 6, 7 out of 10 people following the Watts case, they'll tell you, oh, Chris Watts is a covert narcissist, or a communal narcissist sociopath, something like that, or psychopath. And there's another area where if you're new to true crime, you're going to, well, first of all, you're going to think you're very clever, because everywhere you go you can say he's, and you put your label there, and so you know the case, you know what's going on. You've got kind of an expert opinion at your beck and call. But if you know true crime, you'll also know that using labels is very dangerous, and the reason is you get your label wrong and everything else is probably going to be wrong. All your reasons flowing from that label are going to be off. So I think narcissism is a factor in the Watts case in terms of the dynamics, in terms of Chris Watts wanting a happily ever after, in terms of Shan'ann wanting children when she was sick, when especially the second child, Cece, was not healthy, struggling with allergies and just not a very healthy child, and now she wanted a third child. I think narcissism is an aspect where Kessinger was in a relationship when she shouldn't have been. But all of this stuff is ordinary narcissism that you and I have as well. We want to be regarded well. We want to be liked on social media. We want to think that we're attractive. We want to be attractive to other people. It's very seldom that pure narcissism goes into crime. Very, very seldom. It's got to do with other things beyond narcissism. And there are very few high-profile true crime cases that are to do with narcissism as a major, major factor. The only two that I can think of are Oscar Pistorius, who didn't have his lower legs and wanted to be seen as a able-bodied person. Very narcissistic just in that aspect, but also in general, as an Olympian and all that kind of thing, being a star and a medal on television and a celebrity. And that was kind of what he was. He was a celebrity. He was also like a brand ambassador, just like Shan'ann was. And one can argue that is healthy narcissism. You can say, well, if you don't have your legs, that's healthy narcissism. In the other case that comes to mind is O.J. Simpson. He was also a celebrity. He was also in the public eye. He also felt that he deserved what he thought he deserved. That there was an excess of narcissism. With Chris Watts, I think it's the opposite, and that is what is so crazy about the people following this case is, for an individual who's less narcissistic than most to say that he's more narcissistic than most, or, oh no, he's a narcissist but it's covert or it's communal, it's just not true. But I get that most people don't believe that. That they like the sound of it. They like that it sort of sounds bad. It gives them a sense of satisfaction that first of all they know Chris Watts, and also that they know they've got a handle on his motive and stuff. That you don't, but it's a nice feeling to have. And in that respect, all those people who sort of say, well, yeah, he was a narcissist, whatever. Why is it that Shan'ann made that glowing tribute to him? How come she loved him until the day she died? How come Nicole Kissinger was attracted to him? How come everybody loved Chris until he committed murder? So in that sense, did he only become a narcissist when he committed the crime? Because he didn't do anything that people didn't like prior to that. So how is narcissism a bad thing then, if it is because of narcissism? I just want to reiterate that we see it through the rearview mirror, but the fact is, Chris Watts, until he committed the crime, everybody liked him. His wife wanted to stay married to him. He wanted to leave his wife, but his wife wanted to stay married to him. So what was it about him that was so objectionable? What was it about his narcissism that was so objectionable? And if you actually know Chris Watts's personality, he was actually a very self-deprecating person. He was very go with the flow. He was very non-confrontational. He was very much putting others' wishes before his own, and that's the opposite of a narcissist. Narcissism is about putting yourself first, about selfishness, in a basic way. And I know a lot of people talking about the narcissism thing say, no, he was this kind of narcissist. But it's actually a self-defeating argument, because Chris Watts wasn't narcissistic. He was less narcissistic than most. And I would argue a communal narcissist would want to be on social media if what the community thinks about them is so important. But he didn't. He didn't want to be on social media. Unlike most people in the world, most people have that narcissism that makes them want to be on social media and wants to be popular and liked and all that kind of thing. Chris Watts didn't have that. He wasn't interested. His reality is different to yours. Okay, so we are now half an hour into this episode, and now I want to get to grips with the timeline. How long was Saratoga Trail a crime scene? Now, as I say, about a month ago, another creator brought up this question, and I thought it was quite an interesting and valid question. How long was Saratoga Trail a crime scene? And what the creator said during his episode was something like, it was a crime scene for 2 hours after Chris Watts confessed, and then not. And I don't know much more than that, but I assume that the point he was trying to make was that because it was a crime scene for such a short time, the police botched the investigation, and there's actually a lot more going on here. There is this accessory and that accessory, there was this car and that car. There was a lot of accessories running around, and the police didn't know about it because they just had this really pathetic investigation that lasted basically 2 hours. So my response to that is, besides it being garbage, the house was investigated not as a crime scene, but it was looked at from around about noon on Monday, right? And then they also brought in cadaver dogs, that's plural, the next day, right? So you had quite a lot going on in the house before it was officially declared a crime scene. Now, you can make the case. You can say, well, okay, so it was only officially a crime scene for this length of time, and we're going to look at the length of time in a second. But I first just want to use a little bit of common sense and say, okay, it may not have been a crime scene, but how many people entered the scene and searched? And you might say, yes, but it needs to be a proper search. You need it sealed off. You need the inhabitant, the suspect, out of the crime scene, and that is true. If it was a crime scene earlier, goodness knows what the cadaver dogs would have found, and also what they would have found on that sheet before it was washed, assuming it was washed on Monday night. So that is a factor, but another factor is, which you can't kind of get away from, is you look at Coonrod on his knees. I think it's Coonrod, and he's sort of examining the carpet up close. It's not nighttime. There's a scene where another officer is doing that. I'm talking about where it's in the middle of the day, and he goes down to eye level with the carpet, and he has his torch on, even though it's day, and he goes through the carpet looking for traces. And I'm really glad he did that, because that's where I believe the crime happened, but you don't see anything there. Why? Well, isn't it because, as I said earlier, crime scenes are also not what you see is what you get. Something happened there, and whatever happened was then changed to make it look like nothing happened there. And carpets are hard to read, because a carpet can have a imprint on it, it can have a stain on it, but then you can remove both. You can remove the imprint by sort of brushing the carpet, and also by cleaning the carpet, and also by vacuuming the carpet. But that doesn't mean there was never a stain there. Chris Watts had two opportunities to clean the crime scene. The one was the morning of the murder, and the other one was the night after. Now, a lot of people think the crime played out just the way Chris Watts said, that Shan'ann was murdered late, sort of not late, but just before he exited the crime scene, like at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, after they had sex, after she slept. I don't think that happened. I think it happened much earlier, which is why the crime scene is as it is, why it's so clean. Because he had about 2 hours to clean the crime scene regarding her. And that's a part that I think, again, just shows the naivete of people that support or are interested in this case but don't really understand true crime. Is Chris Watts already had killed his children, so he knew how long it would take to clean that up and to take care of that aspect. So with Shan'ann, are you really going to say, okay, well, I'm going to lie in bed next to you, which I don't believe happened either. I mean, as far as he was concerned, they were separating. As far as they were concerned, him and her, they were separating. And he didn't really want her to, even when they'd reconciled, they were still sleeping separately. So the whole idea of going to Aspen was to repair that aspect. But I don't think Shan'ann anticipated coming home to her husband sleeping in her bed with her. And I don't think Chris Watts wanted that either. And also don't think he wanted to have sex with her. I don't think she wanted to have sex with him. I think she was tired and dirty and pregnant and not well and worried. And he had his things going on as well. So I do think the crime happened much earlier, which is why the crime scene that greeted Coonrod when he arrived at noon on Monday was as innocent looking as it was. And the same applies to what Nicole Atkinson saw and Nicholas Atkinson. It's because he had time to clean up most of the crime scene. I think the one aspect he kind of overlooked was the bed. And so he had to tear the bed apart and throw parts around so that the fitted sheet would not stick out as missing. I think the bed didn't quite look the way he'd left it, and so that he needed to quickly address before everyone came in. So to address this question of was this a crime scene for 2 hours after Chris Watts confessed, like officially, we're going to go to the source, which is the discovery documents, and there are 58 references in all to crime scene. Now, bear in mind there was actually more than one crime scene. There was Survey 319, and that was a crime scene long after Watts' confession. I mean, they were still trying to recover the bodies from there. So that's another aspect to bear in mind, is that there were at least 2 crime scenes. You could include Watts' vehicle as another one. In any event, let's stick to the merits of the question. How long was 2825 a crime scene? And I think a good place to start is page 718 of the discovery documents. It refers to crime scene photographs, and they were taken, I think, by Matthew Saylor, unless he's just the reporting officer. And these crime scene photos, as far as I know, we haven't seen them. They should be on page 721, and there is no page 721. So, and anyway, the crime scene photos, the report for that is dated the 27th of August. Now, I don't know if that assumes that it was still a crime scene at that date, or whether that was simply when the report was filed. But I think there's a little bit of uncertainty there. So where I think it gets interesting and more relevant is page 809 of the discovery. It is the crime scene report. It is dated August 14th, or well, that's the date of request, August 14th. So this is Tuesday, and the date of the offence obviously was August 13th. Date of the report, September 13th. So the date of this crime scene report is almost like a month later, right? In any event, the narrative of the report is as follows. On Tuesday, August 14th, at 2300, and this is crime scene analyst CSA Dave Yoakum, was contacted by the crime scene manager, CSM Maloney, and requested to respond to 2825 Saratoga Trail. And he was asked to go there first thing in the morning at 0600 on Wednesday, August 15th, right? So even though he was contacted sort of late at night, this was basically while Watts was being interrogated by Coda, or sort of as that interrogation was sort of wrapping up. He was asked to come to the crime scene first thing the next morning and sort of process the residents. Then he says, after the Saratoga Trail scene was processed, I was notified at 16:30 hours on August 15th to respond to a remote location in Roggan. Now, what that is suggesting is that he was at the crime scene from 6 o'clock in the morning. That's the time that he said he had to report. At 16:30, so it sounds like he may have been there for 10 hours. Of course, it's also possible that he processed the crime scene and then he was notified an undisclosed amount of time later on. I don't think so. It takes a long time to process a crime scene. And this is a big house. There was the basement to process. When we say process, we mean fingerprint, use Blue Star chemical reagent, look for fibers. A lot of it's visual as well, but a lot of it is doing a very close-up scan of certain objects and gathering evidence. You know, it's evidence handling and evidence gathering is slow going. You've got to suit up almost like in hazmat suits, and you've got to be very careful with your swabs, and they've got to be labeled, and so it takes a long time. And bear in mind there were 3 floors to process: the basement floor, the living area on the ground floor, and then the first story, plus the stairs, plus the vehicle. So there's a heck of a lot to go through because it was an unusually big house. Okay, so I've just gone a little bit further down the page, and it does it is explicit saying that they were done with the scene. I'm talking about the processing of the scene, which is not. It doesn't mean that the crime scene is now released. Just that the CSI part, the processing has been completed, and that apparently was completed by 10:45 on August the 15th. So it basically took about almost 5 hours, right? Almost 5 hours to process the scene from just before 6 o'clock until almost 11 o'clock. Now, I think this already addresses what the other creator was saying, was that, well, they weren't at the crime scene very long. Well, this is already 5 hours on the 15th. This is prior to Chris Watts' confession. Now, I get what he says. How long did they process the scene after his confession? The thing is, you don't really need to go back to the scene if you've already processed it, unless there's something you don't know, right? So it's not as though they didn't process the scene. They did. They had. 5 hours is a long time to be doing that. And let's go through what he says they did. And this is page 810 of the discovery. It's authored by CSA Dave Yoakum. He says, upon my arrival at the residence, I met with Frederick Police Department Detective Baumhover and officers Wallier and Perez. There's another aspect just to emphasize is there were a lot of people processing the scene. It's not as though you had one officer. So if you're going to say that this investigation was botched or whatever, it wasn't. There were a lot of officers, there were a lot of resources being used, and important resources like the CBI and the FBI and multiple police departments simultaneously. Yoakum goes on to say, according to Baumhover, the house had been searched with the consent of the owner. That's important to say as well. The fact that Watson consented to the search meant that it was like taking out a search warrant, except you didn't need it. He also says that the house was searched on 3 different occasions. So what is this creator saying? How many times do you need to search the house to find something if there's nothing that was found? Yoakum says the searches were conducted by members of Frederick Police Department and included canine searches from cadaver dogs. Baumhover also stated the owner, husband and father of the missing woman and children had given consent to collect any and all evidence that police could use to locate his missing family. So you don't need to make a place a crime scene if it's already being treated effectively as one, where you're collecting evidence, you're investigating, and the owner is kind of standing outside anyway, right? Bear in mind at this point they don't know what's going on. Is someone missing? For a missing persons case, this is very, very quickly escalated and very, very quickly prosecuted, but also very, very quickly investigated. I mean, cadaver dogs after one afternoon effectively is incredible. What's also stated to Baumhover, the home could be processed with forensic methods to obtain evidence relating to the family's disappearance. Baumhover and I agreed that I would photograph the residence, utilize Blue Star bloodstain reagent, alerted on by the canines, and then assist with the collection of any evidence located in the residence. It was agreed upon that CBI would not collect the evidence. Frederick Police Department would collect and package all evidence located in the search. According to Baumhover, Watts had been living in and accessing the home prior to and since the disappearance of his family. Scene observations: the neighborhood and home is located within a newer residential area. He goes on to say the home has 5 bedrooms and 4 bathrooms with office space, an unfinished basement, and a 3-car garage. Think about that. A 3-car garage and there's only 1 car inside it. The truck's not allowed inside. He goes on to say, upon entering the front door, there's living room and dining room. To the left is a staircase that leads to the upstairs bedrooms, laundry and loft area. Near the staircase that leads upstairs is a hallway that runs to the east side of the house. The hallway provides access to the basement stairs, a bathroom, utility room, garage entrance and an office. On the south side of the residence is a full kitchen, eating area and additional family room. A door on the south side of the kitchen opens to the backyard of the home. So he goes on to describe the bedrooms, the playroom, the laundry room, living room, television room, and then he says the home is in, quote, like new, end quote, condition with no visible signs of damage and was clean and organized. He goes on to say a walkthrough of the home showed no signs of forced entry at all. Basement and first floor windows, no doors appear to have been forced or damaged. So, you know, if you are looking for evidence of an intruder, then you want to look at things like that. Is there any forced entry anywhere? And the answer is no. So you're already seeing that it looks like an inside job if something has happened. Then he talks about scene processing. He says photos were taken. I was very interested in this aspect and very surprised that, if the cadaver dog's evidence is strong evidence, so is this Blue Star reagent. And he talks about Blue Star latent blood reagent was applied to all bathroom fixtures. Why? Because that's often where evidence is disposed of. The crime may happen somewhere else, but then the blood is washed away. And he refers to these fixtures being tub, showers, sink and toilet. He says there were no signs of chemiluminescence, which is kind of telling you that the way that the murders took place was not a drop of blood was shed. And that is quite incredible. It's quite amazing that Watts did that without shedding blood. But having said that, he was a trusted member of the family. They didn't expect to be murdered, and that gave him a unique advantage in killing them when it suited him and how it suited him, and in a kind of invisible way. And what is more invisible than a sedation or a strangling in the middle of the night? Where he got the jump on Shan'ann, where she didn't expect what was going to happen to him. He goes on to say, I observed in the kitchen trash bed sheets and pillowcases. So it's quite amazing that it seems like he found that. Joachim found it, and he found it quite late. He found it as late as Wednesday morning, right? It's quite late to actually find that. He says the sheets and pillowcases were greyish in colour, with numerous small light blue, green, lavender coloured squares on the sheets. The bedding was buried beneath other items of trash. So there's another aspect where a lot of people said Chris Watts didn't know what he was doing or whatever, but he clearly was covering up. I mean, putting the bedding under trash, the idea was to contaminate the bedding, right? He goes on to say, further examination showed the sheets to be a flat sheet and 3 matching pillowcases. So something's missing here, isn't it? And the fitted sheet is missing. Besides the kids' blankies. He goes on to say stains were observed on the sheets and pillowcases. He doesn't identify what the stains were. And surely if they smelled, he would have said so. He would have said they smelled of excrement or whatever. He doesn't say that. Probably because they were washed. And again, that stain looks like it's slightly washed out. It looks like it created a stain, but the stain he wasn't able to remove. And that suggests also that maybe Chris Watts picked that up when he ran through the house, and it remained where it was until the end of Monday, and that is why it created a stain. That's also a possibility. Now we're on page 811. The bedding from the kitchen trash was collected by Frederick Police Department. Throughout the home, several electronic items and clothing were located and collected. CBI cleared the scene at 10:45 on August 15th, 2018. No evidence was collected by CBI. And then it goes on to talk about Anadarko. So to come back to the creator who said, Saratoga was only a crime scene for 2 hours after Chris Watts confessed. If you go to page 814, it refers to the scene investigation of the vehicles. So the vehicles were processed on August the 21st. So, 5-6 days after Chris Watts confessed, the investigation was ongoing now with the vehicles, and this happened at 10:00 hours, and there were a couple of people involved, and this took place at 241 to 245 Oak Street in Frederick. and I'm not going to go into the processing, but it was the processing of both vehicles, and I think you can argue that the processing of the vehicles is an extension of the processing of 2825. Why? Because both vehicles were at 2825 when the crime happened, right? Both vehicles, the Lexus and the work truck, were part of the whole crime fabric of 2825 when the crime happened. So they're still investigating the vehicles on the 21st of August. And according to the report, CBI cleared the scene at 13:30 hours on August 21st, 2018. So the processing of the vehicles took 3.5 hours, and that's about half as long as it took to process the house, if you remember correctly. If we jump to page 1076 of the discovery, this time dealing with Baumhover's description of the crime scene, he talks about that he noticed that the bottom fitted sheet was missing and at least one pillowcase had some type of dark residue upon it. Interestingly, he says this residue contained what appeared to be glitter, which sounds like he's suggesting that it could have been mascara or makeup or something like that. If you look carefully at the pillowcase, there's actually two parts of it. There are two sections where there are marks on it. One that's kind of in the middle and another that's sort of on the boundary. So something that's also possible is that it wasn't excrement. It's not a case of excrement or mascara. It could actually even be both. And that makes sense because Chris Watts spoke about Shannann's face being smeared, that there were sort of black tears left by the mascara. That part had a ring of truth. Often when you use colorful language like that, it is grounded in reality. Not always, but often. Obviously, when you do a crime scene search through the document, quite a few of the terms that come up are for the autopsy. So while a lot of this was going on, while the investigation was underway, there was also an autopsy underway as early as the 17th of August, which is the day after Chris Watts's arrest. Chris Watts was kind of arrested very late on the 15th, and then he went to jail very early on the 16th. So when you say a day after, we're talking about the end of the 15th, which is effectively the 16th. The part that deals pertinently with the issue of when was the crime scene sort of handed over after Chris Watts's confession, we're going to deal with that now. It really goes to page 85 of the discovery. When you look at Officer Lyon's report, in the final paragraph, she talks about on Wednesday, August 16th, at approximately 15:30, I reported for duty and was asked to respond to Aggregate Boulevard in Wyndon to hand out flyers, and then at 6 o'clock she was instructed to sit on the south side of the house and not allow anyone in or out of the home. And that was kind of when, roundabout while she was on duty, it appears that the Deputy District Attorney Wren arrived and kind of showed her his credentials. So I don't think you can say that after 2 hours the house was no longer a crime scene. If you just look at this, on August 16th at 6 o'clock, right? So this is 18 hours effectively after Chris Watts's confession. They were still sort of maintaining custody of the house, right? And Officer Lyons was doing perimeter security, not allowing anyone not authorized to step on the property. Doesn't that qualify as a crime scene and, taking the necessary precautions after it's been declared a crime scene? I'm just saying the claim that it was a crime scene for just 2 hours is a bit of a stretch. She says at 23:28, this is on the 16th, she made sure that the search warrant was completed and evidence had been secured in patrol vehicles. She handed the crime scene log over to Officer Wallier and left the scene. So even when Officer Lyons left, it was still a crime scene, this time in the care, under the care and control of Officer Wallier. And let's go to his report to see what happens after this. Okay, so on page 125, Officer Wallier talks about being involved in the processing of the vehicles on the 21st of August with CBI agent Dave Yoakum, so he was obviously assisting there. On page 129, he talks about a lengthy consensual search early in the day on August 15th, and then he arrives back at 2825 Saratoga Trail to conduct a search warrant based on new information that had arisen, obviously that had arisen during the course of August 15th. Remember what Chris Watts had said was that he'd found Shan'ann strangling the children and where that was. So they were obviously going to check their beds to see if there was evidence there. I'm talking about the beds of the children. According to Chris Watts' version, he killed Shan'ann on one of the beds belonging to the children, not on his own bed, right? So at 22:12, 12 minutes past 12, Officer Wallier and Officer Manley and Sergeant Bakes began the execution of the search warrant. Officer Lyons kept a crime scene log outside the residence, which we referred to a moment ago. I took a photograph of Sergeant Bakes holding the signed search warrant outside in front of the residence prior to entry. Now, you may recall all of this from previous footage where you see officers inside the house at night with the dog barking. Well, this is what it's referring to. At 23:12, Well County Assistant District Attorney Wren and another Assistant District Attorney Roach arrived on scene to observe. He goes on to say various evidentiary items were collected, including bedding and related items. A video baby monitor with 2 accompanying cameras were collected. While on scene, Sergeant Bakes took video handheld using his Axon body camera of a reenactment scenario requested earlier by the investigatory team that I participated in. So during this, that was really early to do a reenactment if you think about it, on the night of August 15th. So basically, within hours of Chris Watts giving that version, they already reenacting it and testing it out. It says the perspective of the video taken was a close-up of the baby monitor. A laptop was collected, photographs were taken, all items were immediately transported. On August 16 at 11 minutes past midnight, the front door was locked. I released the scene and Well County Dispatch was informed. And that's the end of his report. So Chris Watts confessed. Depends on which time you want to take, but it was actually quite early in the evening. It was around about I think so around about between 4 and 6 o'clock. He kind of first gave his confession to his father, and then he gave more details to the cops. So to boil it down to a moment is quite difficult, but it certainly happened relatively early in the evening. Before 6 o'clock. I mean, by 6 o'clock, people were already going to Anadarko to go and check what was going on there. So by then he'd confessed, right? So to say that it was only a crime scene for 2 hours, I mean, it was already, if you take it as 6 o'clock, then by the time Wallier left early the next morning, that's already 6 hours that it was a crime scene. Right? This is according to this report, and then there's another one to look at as well. We're now on page 391 of the discovery, and it refers to a a narrative by an investigator, Jesse Lambert, and it refers to the 17th of August at 13:25. I was asked by Officer Davies with Frederick PD to assist with the burglary in process. I'm not going to talk about that too much. And then Officer Davies asked me to call the Weld County District Attorney's Office to see if the defense team was allowed to be in the house while they contacted the defense team. I spoke to District Attorney Investigator Kathy Holscher, and she advised that the house had been released as a crime scene and the defense team was allowed to be there. So this is quite interesting, is making the argument that, and you can almost argue that this is the kind of argument a defense lawyer would make on the side of Chris Watts, would say, wow, how long was this a crime scene? How long did you investigate it? How early did you hand it over to the police? Well, why was it handed over? So that the defense could get going. And that's an incredible aspect of this case, is how quickly it was proceeding from suspect to searches, to confession, to reenactment, to defense team getting involved, to plea deal, to sentencing. I mean, it just unbelievably fast. Something else just to be aware of is on page 72 of the discovery, it refers to when Chris Watts' work truck was removed. This was on August 15th at about 10 to 9. So that's also really early. It's very shortly after the confession, like within hours of the confession, had already taken his car away that same night. That was 10 to 9 on August 15th. And Sergeant Bakes was on duty when this happened. So I think the answer to the question is, how long was it a crime scene after Chris Watts confessed? Well, we know that on August the 16th, it was still a crime scene at 23:28. So almost a full 24 hours into the next day, it was still a crime scene, and it was left. The crime scene log was handed over to Officer Wallier, suggesting it was still a crime scene. So the whole notion that it was only a crime scene for 2 hours, or investigated for only 2 hours, I think is overly simplistic, and I don't think it's accurate. The crime scene was investigated in terms of, there were multiple interrogations going on, vehicles were being removed and checked, multiple sites were being checked, autopsies were being undertaken. And there were multiple searches. There's multiple searches, reenactments. So I don't think it's accurate to say that this investigation was not sufficient or lacking in any way, or there was contamination from the police side. I don't think the case was compromised at all. I think it was a very quickly investigated and interrogated and prosecuted case. I do think one of the biggest dangers facing the case was the fact that Watts had allowed Nicole Atkinson and her son into the house, and he could have argued in a defense case that they had compromised the scene. Nicholas Atkinson finding her phone, for example, could have been seen as, he could have argued that that was evidence tampering. So on Patreon, on April 29th, so about a month ago, I put up a quiz, and I asked, how long was 2825 Saratoga Trail a crime scene? And most people said, since Watts allowed officers to search the scene before it technically became a crime scene, the crime scene designation is misleading. That's what most of my patrons said. Then there were a couple who said Officer Lyons maintained the crime scene log until 23:28, then handed it over to Officer Wallier. That is a better answer and a better explanation. Some said that it was a crime scene for several weeks or months. Some said that it was 2 hours. The answer that I was looking for was at least 23 hours and 28 minutes. So basically, if we take the fact that Chris Watts confessed sometime on the 15th, right, then it was a crime scene until 23 hours, 28 minutes on the 16th. And we know that that at least is true based on what Officer Lyons said. We don't know whether it was finally released, when it was finally released after that, but we know that it was at least a crime scene based on Officer Lyons maintaining it until 23 hours, 28 minutes on Thursday night, the 16th of August. And so all of this is really just to dispute this claim that it was a crime scene for only 2 hours. I think the creator came up with this time based on Officer Wallier talking about giving up the scene at 11 minutes past midnight on the 16th, but he doesn't see the continuity after that, or the context of Chris Watts confessing way earlier than like 11 o'clock that night or 10 o'clock that night. So that was just something I wanted to address in terms of common misconceptions regarding the Watts case. Okay, so we're already 70 minutes into this video. I'm going to wrap up now. For those interested in my content on Patreon, every Wednesday and Thursday is another episode of the Kessinger tapes and the Watts tapes. The Kessinger tapes is a review of all the transcripts, some that aren't part of the discovery that are available. Some of the transcripts go beyond what you can actually hear in the audio, so that the actual typed transcripts go beyond that. And then there's also the Watts tapes, which just deals with highlights of the first confession, and so far there's quite a lot of interest in that. For those interested in the audiobooks, I'm currently busy with Beneath the Oil, the second book in the Watts series, and that is on the $5 tier on Patreon, along with quite a few other books as well. As I mentioned earlier, I update Patreon multiple times a day covering major cases, and you're getting quite good value for around $1 a month. Quite a lot of content, as I say, updated daily. And that concludes this trilogy of content, trilogy of 3 episodes on the Chris Watts case. I hope you found it worth listening to. There will be another episode on the Madeleine McCann case following this episode, and then I'm going to return to coverage of Vincent van Gogh, the murder of Vincent van Gogh. He was actually murdered at the end of July, 130 years ago. If you're not interested in Van Gogh and you're not interested in art or anything like that, give one of the episodes a listen. Over the next 2 months, we're going through the last 30 letters he wrote in his life, and he wrote virtually a letter every second day. And so we get a really good look into, just like Shan'ann posted on Facebook, we get a very good look into his movements, his mindset, his motivations. Bear in mind, it's popularly believed that he committed suicide. So a letter every second day, and quite long letters, giving us a good idea of his psychology and where he was, what kind of attitude he had to things that were happening. And by the end of that, we should be in a very good position to tell whether indeed he committed suicide, whether it was an accidental shooting, or whether it was something else. So give just one episode a listen, and you'll probably be hooked onto something else. As for the rest of you, again, thank you for listening. Stay safe. Keep up that social distancing. We're coming out of lockdown here tomorrow, the 1st of June. When I say lockdown level 4 down to level 3, one of the things we'll be allowed to buy is alcohol. So I'll be one of those buying some. And I'll be able to walk my dog. I think we've both been looking forward to that. And look after each other, make sure you get enough sleep. The best thing you can do right now is stay healthy. So I wish you not just to stay away from the virus, but to put yourself in a place where you can stay healthy, build up your fitness, build up your immunity. Your immunity is your best guard against this virus. So take care, and I'll see you guys next time.